Good morning. So I'm gonna talk about chapters 21 and 22 today. So chapter 21 started out by touching on topics such as the employment at will doctrine, constitutional provisions, the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1871, and the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and so on. More topics to dive into as well. To start out, the employment of at-will doctrine is a contract of employment for an indeterminate term, is terminal at will by either the employer or the employee. A public policy exception is an exception to the employment at will doctrine that makes it unlawful to dismiss an employees for taking certain actions in the public interest. An implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing exceptions is an exception to the employment at will doctrine based on the theory that every employment contract, even an unwritten one, contains implicit understanding that the parties will deal fairly with each other. Moving on, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1871, both were discriminating on the basis of race and ethnicity. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1991 were both discriminating in terms and conditions of employment on main reasons being the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and or national origin. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 was wage discrimination on the basis of sex, women, age discrimination. In Employment Act of 1967 was discrimination in terms and conditions of employment on the basis of age when you are an affected individual who is 40 years of age or older. Then the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was discrimination on the basis of a handicap, and this was also ruled out by the government or non-government contractors. Americans with Disability Acts of 1991 was the discrimination in employment on the basis of disability, not so much handicap, but more of disabled individuals. Title VII is the statute that prohibits discrimination in both the hiring and the firing or other terms and conditions of employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and or national origin. A disparate treatment occurs when the employer treats one employee less favorable than another because of that employee's color, race, religion, sex, and or national origin. So from there, a disparate impact occurs when the employer's facially neutral policy or practice has a discriminatory effect on employees who belong to a protected class themselves. Diving into chapter 21, the chapter had touched on harassment and common types of harassment found in the workplace. An executive exemption is exemption to the ADEA that allows mandatory retirement of executives at age 65. An affirmative action plan is a program adopted by employers to increase the representation of women and minorities in the workforce. Reverse discrimination is discrimination in favor of members of groups that have been previously discriminated against. These claims are usually raised by white males. Sorry about that. And then Chapter 22 had given a concise overview of environmental law, beginning with a nuisance, an unreasonable interference with someone else's use and enjoyment of his or her land. Technology forcing standards are standards of pollution control set primarily on the basis of health considerations, with the assumption that once regulators have set the standards, industries will then be forced to develop the technology needed to meet them. A technology-driven standard is a standards taken into account of existing levels of technology and require the best control system possible given the limits of that technology. An environmental protection agency is the federal agency charged with the responsibility of conducting an integrated, coordinated attack on all forms of pollution of the environment. And then an environmental impact statement, a statement that must be prepared for every major federal activity, ultimately providing the significant effect, the quality of the human environment. Point sources are distinct places from which pollutants are discharged into the water, so these would include paper mills, electric utility plants, and sewage treatment facilities, and also factories. The effluent limitations are maximum allowable amount of pollutants that can be discharged from a point source within a given period of time. When discussing regulating air quality, the chapter identified certain pollutants and the associated problems connected to those pollutants. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards are a two-tiered set of standards developed for the chief conventional air pollutants. And I wanted to touch on a manifest program. It is a program that attempts to see that hazardous waste or properly transported. A manifest program is a program that attempts to see that hazardous waste or properly transported disposal facilities licensed by the EPA. A superfund is a fund authorized by CERCLA to cover the cost of cleaning up hazardous waste disposal sites whose owners cannot be found or unwilling to pay for the cleanup or are unable to pay for the cleanup. And to sum up, the chapter then ended by covering the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990, global dimensions of environmental regulation, toxic substances found in water, and contamination. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day.